You think camping in the wilderness is all about peace and quiet? That the only thing you'll hear are the sounds of birds, wind rustling through the trees, and the crackle of your campfire? But what if the forest wasn't as empty as you thought? What if, in the silence of the woods, there was something else waiting? Something that didn't belong there? Today, I have 3 spine-chilling true camping horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the great outdoors. Do you believe in things that lurk just beyond your campsite? Things that follow you even when you can't see them? Stay tuned, because the stories you're about to hear are ones that no camper ever expects to experience. But they're real, and they'll make you wonder just how safe you are when the sun goes down. These aren't your typical ghost stories, nor are they myths told to scare children. These are real, true events that happened to people just like you and me. People who went into the woods thinking they were safe, thinking they knew what to expect from nature. But what they found instead, what they encountered in the stillness of the forest, changed everything. Imagine being so deep into the wilderness, you can't see the lights of civilization. No sounds of cars, no phones ringing. You're miles away from anything or anyone. The perfect getaway. But then, something happens. Something you can't explain. And no matter how hard you try to dismiss it, it's right there, lurking just behind your awareness. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in anything beyond what I could see or touch. I was always the logical one, the one who brushed off the weird things people said about the wilderness, the whispers of strange creatures, the eerie sense of being watched in the dark. But everything changed that weekend, when Greg and I decided to get away for a few days in the woods. We had picked out a spot deep in the forest, a place so quiet and remote that it felt like we were the only ones in the world. There was something peaceful about it, something that made us feel disconnected from the stress and noise of everyday life. It was just the two of us, far away from the distractions of the city, far away from people, just us and nature. We spent the day setting up our tent and making ourselves comfortable. The air was crisp, the trees were tall and magnificent, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves was all around us. We made a fire, roasted marshmallows, and sat back to enjoy the evening. The sky was clear, and the stars were scattered across the night like diamonds. I couldn't remember the last time I felt so at peace. At first, everything felt perfect. Greg was in high spirits, making jokes as he set up our camp stove, while I gathered some extra firewood. I remember smiling at how easily we fell into our little routine, like we'd done this 100 times before. But as the night wore on, something started to change. There was an unsettling feeling that crept up on me, one I couldn't shake. It wasn't something I could explain, not at first. It was as if the world had shifted, and the trees that once felt welcoming now seemed like silent sentinels, watching us with eyes that we couldn't see. I tried to brush it off. I figured it was just the natural eeriness of being out in the woods, far away from everything. The wind had picked up a little, making the trees sway and creak, and that made some sounds feel unfamiliar. But then, I noticed something, a movement in the distance, just at the edge of the trees. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal or the wind. But every time I glanced over, the movement was there again, almost like something, or someone, was watching us. I didn't mention it to Greg at first. I didn't want to worry him, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It only grew stronger as the night deepened. I tried to convince myself that I was just being jumpy, but there was a nagging thought in the back of my mind that wouldn't let go. We settled into our tent for the night, the fire crackling softly outside. It was just after midnight when I woke up. At first, I thought I had heard something outside, but I couldn't be sure. The wind was still howling, and the leaves were rustling like they always did. But then I realized that the zipper to our tent was wide open. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced over at where Greg was sleeping. I couldn't see the outline of his body in the dim light, but something wasn't right. The zipper was open. I had made sure to close it when we got inside. I checked it twice, and yet, there it was, wide open. My breath caught in my throat. "Greg," I whispered, my voice trembling. But there was no answer. Panic gripped me as I sat up, my eyes darting around the tent. Greg's sleeping bag was undisturbed, but he wasn't there. I called his name softly, my voice breaking the silence of the night. "Greg, where are you?" No response. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the air itself had grown heavy. I climbed out of the tent, my heart racing, and stood there for a moment, trying to collect myself. The fire outside had died down to embers, and the woods were completely still. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like something is out there waiting. I stepped away from the tent, calling out Greg's name again, but there was no answer. The darkness was thick, and every step I took felt like I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't understand. The trees loomed over me like silent witnesses, and every small noise made my heart skip a beat. As I moved further away from camp, I started to hear it, soft footsteps behind me. They weren't regular, but they were there, just outside my reach. I spun around, but the shadows offered no explanation. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I told myself that I was overreacting, but as I walked, the footsteps grew louder. I could hear them following me, just out of sight, just enough to make my blood run cold. Something was definitely out there. Then, I saw it. Or rather, I saw him. At first, I thought it was Greg, standing by a tree in the distance. His figure was silhouetted against the faint light from the fire, his body unmoving, just standing there, staring at me. I called out to him, relief flooding through me. "Greg!" I cried, rushing toward him. But as I got closer, something was wrong. His posture was off, rigid, unnatural, and his eyes were wide open, but they were empty, blank, frozen. "Greg?" I asked, but there was no response. It was like he wasn't even hearing me. The figure just stood there, staring at me, and I could feel my legs growing weak beneath me. I took a step closer, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't Greg. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stared at me with those hollow, lifeless eyes, as if it were something pretending to be him. In a burst of terror, I turned and ran back toward the tent, not daring to look back. My mind was racing, and my body felt like it was moving on its own. I had to get back. I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found myself back at camp. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I had seen. I don't remember much of the rest of the night. I stayed awake, listening to every sound, my heart racing. When the sun finally came up, I found the courage to go back into the woods, hoping to find some trace of Greg. But there was nothing. No sign of him. Only the woods, silent and still. The police found Greg's body the next day, but they couldn't explain how he had died. His injuries were strange, unnatural, like he had been twisted in ways that the human body shouldn't be. They found no footprints around his body, no evidence of anyone else nearby. It was as if he had just disappeared. I never went back to that forest. The woods didn't feel like nature anymore. They felt like something else, something that I couldn't understand. I never found out what really happened to Greg. Maybe it was something that the woods had claimed, or maybe it was something else altogether. But one thing is for certain, I'll never forget the way he looked at me that night. I don't know who or what was standing by that tree, pretending to be Greg, but I don't ever want to find out again. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun and adventure. A few friends, a secluded lake, and the thrill of camping in the woods, far away from the chaos of city life. I remember the excitement in the air as we packed our gear and made our way out into the wild. We had all heard the rumors about the lake before. The stories about strange disappearances, whispers in the night, and the haunting of the water that seemed to draw people in. But no one really took them seriously. After all, these were just ghost stories passed down over time, right? It was a beautiful spot, tucked deep in the forest, the kind of place that looked like it had come straight out of a painting. The lake, with its glassy surface, was surrounded by towering trees that created a natural barrier from the outside world. We set up camp near the water's edge, the sound of the wind through the branches blending with the occasional call of birds. The air was fresh, the sky a perfect shade of blue, and the evening promised nothing more than good food and the laughter of close friends. We spent the afternoon settling in, unpacking, and enjoying the peace of being out in nature. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, we built a campfire and sat around it, the flames dancing and casting shadows on our faces. We were all in high spirits, sharing ghost stories and tales of the supernatural. Everyone had their own version of the haunted lake, each story more outrageous than the last. Some claimed to hear voices on the wind. Others spoke of strange lights dancing on the water. But we laughed it all off, as friends do when they're surrounded by warmth and good company. The campfire crackled, and all was right with the world. But as the night deepened, I began to notice something. It was subtle at first, something that might have easily been dismissed as just the wind or a trick of the light. There were whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, rising from the water. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the others heard it too. Whispers that didn't belong, voices that weren't clear, but seemed to float just out of reach. They came from the lake, drifting through the air like a presence we couldn't quite understand. I shook it off, thinking it was just the wind, but as the shadows grew longer, I noticed something even stranger. There were shapes beneath the surface of the water. They weren't fish or branches. No, they moved in patterns that didn't make sense. I thought it was just the way the moonlight hit the water, creating ripples, but the more I looked, the more I realized something was off. The shadows seemed to shift, undulating in ways that weren't natural. As we all sat there, trying to enjoy the night, the unease grew. But then, Matt, one of our more adventurous friends, suggested a challenge. Why don't I take the canoe out on the lake? I'll row around a bit, give you all something to laugh about, he said, his grin wide. Everyone laughed, encouraging him to go for it. Matt was the type of person who would do anything for a thrill. He grabbed the small canoe and set off, paddling out into the middle of the lake. We waved, but I could feel a twinge of unease in my stomach. Something about the lake just didn't feel right. It wasn't just the whispers or the shadows under the water. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the back of my mind. The hours passed slowly as we sat around the fire, talking and joking. But as the night wore on, the lake grew still. The moon hung high, casting its pale light over the water. We waited for Matt to return, but there was no sign of him. At first, we figured he was just messing around, taking longer than expected. But as the minutes turned into an hour, then two, we started to grow concerned. I stood up, the unease in my chest growing. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice tight with worry. We all stood and stared out across the lake, hoping to see the canoe drifting back to shore, but there was nothing. The water was perfectly still, as if it were holding its breath. We called his name, but the sound of our voices seemed to disappear into the vastness of the lake. I suggested we grab a flashlight and go out looking for him, but the others were hesitant, unsure of what to do. But something in me pushed me forward. I didn't know what was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. We grabbed our flashlights and set out along the water's edge, calling out for Matt. The shadows of the trees stretched long and ominous as we walked, the beam of light from our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The whispers seemed louder now, more urgent, and the strange shadows under the water. They seemed to move again, swirling just beneath the surface. We walked further along the shore, searching for any sign of him. Then, we saw it. Footprints leading into the water, just on the edge of the lake. They weren't Matt's footprints. They were larger, deeper, as if something had come out of the lake and walked along the shore. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Our search continued into the night, the tension thick in the air. We called for Matt, but there was no answer, just the echo of our voices bouncing off the water. The group's fear started to spread, and whispers turned into accusations. "What if something happened to him?" one of us said. "What if the lake?" The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. No one dared finish the thought aloud. It wasn't until the next morning that we found him. He was lying on the shore, just beyond the reach of the water, his body limp and unresponsive. At first, we thought he was dead. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. There was no sign of injury, no signs of a struggle, but something was wrong. His eyes weren't just empty. They were filled with a kind of terror, a terror that I'll never forget. We rushed to his side, shaking him, trying to wake him up. He stirred, his lips trembling as if he were trying to speak, but nothing came out. When he finally opened his mouth, the words he whispered were barely audible. It's down there. It's calling my name." His voice was weak, disoriented. We carried him back to camp, but Matt's condition only worsened. His mind seemed to slip away, his eyes darting around as if he could see something we couldn't. He mumbled about figures under the water, about something pulling him down into the depths, something he couldn't escape. "It wants me," he kept saying. "It wants me to come back." We had no choice but to leave the lake. We didn't know what had happened to Matt, and we didn't want to find out. When we got him medical help, the doctors couldn't find any physical cause for his condition. They said he was dehydrated and exhausted, but there was nothing that could explain the terror in his eyes. But every year, something happens. One of us always feels the pull, the call from that lake, the whispers that never truly fade. No matter how many times we try to leave it behind, the lake keeps pulling us back. It seems to draw someone in, whether they want to go or not. And every time, no one ever really understands what's happened. What happened to Matt, or to the others who went missing before us. All I know is that I'll never go back to that lake. There's something in the water, something we can't see but we all feel. And every year, it's waiting for someone else. It was supposed to be just another camping trip, a weekend getaway to escape the stress of work and life. A few friends, a campfire, some marshmallows, and nothing but the night sky and the sound of the forest around us. We'd been to this campground before. It was quiet, remote, and had always been the perfect spot to unwind. But that night, something felt different. It wasn't the trees or the rustling leaves, but the way the air seemed to thicken, as though it were holding something back. We had just finished setting up our tents, and as the sun began to sink below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across our faces. It felt like the perfect night to tell stories. Funny ones, spooky ones, the usual. But as the night wore on, the stories began to take a darker turn. It started with an old man who had been sitting on a nearby log, watching us with quiet eyes. I didn't even know he was there at first. He was just a figure in the distance, sitting by himself. But when the wind shifted, I heard him speak. His voice was low, gravelly, almost as if it had been worn down by years of solitude. "Y'all shouldn't be out here after dark," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at our group. We all laughed at first, thinking it was just another eccentric old man who had spent too much time alone in the woods. But the tone of his voice made me hesitate. There was something about it that didn't sit right. It wasn't fear in his eyes, but something darker, something ancient. He continued, his words slow and deliberate. "There's something in these woods, something that comes to life when the night falls. It's drawn to the fire. You'll see it if you're not careful. The fire is what keeps it at bay." We all stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or to ask him to leave. But there was no humor in his face. The old man's gaze shifted to the fire, and for a long moment he was silent, almost as if he was listening for something. Then, he looked at us again, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of something older than time itself. "Don't ever let the fire go out. If you do, you'll regret it." I'm not sure what made me take him seriously. Maybe it was the way his eyes flickered with something unsettling, or maybe it was the way the wind had quieted, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. But I remember feeling that the stories we'd been telling weren't the ones we needed to hear that night. After he left, we tried to push the tension aside. We resumed our stories, laughing and joking, but the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't as lighthearted anymore. It was like the air around us had thickened, like the woods were watching, waiting for something to happen. As the hours passed, the fire crackled, its flames dancing in the night. We were all half watching the fire, half listening to the sounds of the forest. Then it came. At first, it was subtle, just a small snap of a branch breaking in the distance. At first, we dismissed it, blaming the wind. But then it happened again, louder this time. Like something moving through the underbrush, something huge, something heavy. We all froze. The laughter died in our throats as the sound of snapping branches grew closer. The shadows around us seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the forest was creeping toward us, inch by inch, reaching for the fire. One of our friends, Daniel, stood up. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. The rest of us tried to talk him out of it, but he was already heading toward the edge of the camp, flashlight in hand. "Don't go too far," someone called out, but Daniel didn't answer. He kept walking, his footsteps slowly fading into the darkness. We tried to keep our eyes on him, but the shadows swallowed him up so quickly. The sounds of the forest grew louder, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and then a sound that I'll never forget. A growl, deep and guttural, like something not quite human. It sent a chill straight down my spine. I glanced at the fire, its flames flickering weakly in the night. The wind had picked up again, and the flames seemed to dance and shudder, as if they were fighting something invisible. A few minutes passed. The sounds of Daniel's footsteps had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The tension in the air was unbearable, and the darkness beyond the fire seemed to be alive, breathing in and out with each passing second. Then we heard it, a loud scream, followed by the sound of something crashing through the woods. We jumped to our feet, calling Daniel's name, but there was no answer. The scream echoed in the distance, then stopped abruptly. It was like the forest had swallowed him whole. We rushed to the edge of the firelight, our flashlights shaking in our hands. We searched the woods, calling his name over and over, but all we found were his footprints, leading into the trees and fading into the blackness. The forest seemed to be mocking us, as if it had swallowed him up, never to give him back. We couldn't understand it. Where had Daniel gone? The air was still thick with fear, and the firelight was now our only protection. We huddled together, not daring to let the fire die, but knowing, deep down, that the flames weren't enough to keep whatever was out there away. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The forest around us grew unnaturally quiet, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. We finally had no choice but to go looking for Daniel. But when we ventured into the woods, we found something. There, at the edge of the firelight, were the remnants of his clothes, torn and burnt, like something had shredded them apart, leaving only the remnants. His shoes were scattered in a haphazard pile, and his jacket was torn to pieces. There was no sign of him, no blood, no trace. Just his clothes abandoned, as if whatever had taken him had left them behind. That's when we realized the truth. The fire had been our only protection. Whatever it was in those woods, it had been drawn to us, to the light, and when the flames had faltered, it had taken Daniel. We had been foolish not to listen to the old man's warning. As dawn finally broke, we managed to leave the campsite, but none of us would ever forget that night. I still return to the campground every year, on the anniversary of that night. I don't stay long, but I always make sure the fire is burning brightly. I leave a warning for anyone who comes across the site, a reminder that the woods are not just a place for adventure. They are a place where something watches, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fire is the only thing that keeps it at bay. Never let it go out. And so ends our journey through the terrifying wilderness, where nature hides more than beauty. It hides secrets. Secrets that not only threaten our sense of safety, but challenge everything we believe to be real. If these stories gave you chills, hit that like button. If they made you think twice before heading out into the woods again, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales of the unknown. After all, there's always more lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But here's a thought. What if you find yourself out there one night, staring into the darkness, hearing the whisper of the trees and wondering, could you be next? Let me know in the comments. What would you have done in these situations? Would you have stayed by the fire, or would you have ventured into the unknown? What do you think really happens in those woods? And until next time, stay safe, if you can, because once the forest calls, you might never be able to walk away.